Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to show you the steps I take as I work through creating a quilt. And if you are new to my channel, I share a lot about different crafts, especially quilting, but from time to time I also do unboxings and reviews. So if you're interested in that sort of content, I would love for you to consider subscribing to my channel and giving this video a like. If you are already subscribed, thank you so much for supporting me. So let's get started on my steps for assembling a quilt. So step number one is always finding that perfect pattern. And today I randomly found this pattern in a magazine and I love the design. It's very modern, vintage. I just think it's a lot of fun, so it really caught my eye. So this is the pattern that I chose. So step one, complete. So after choosing my pattern, I can start thinking about the look that I want for my pattern, because I don't always choose the same colors as the pattern or the same fabrics. So I just kind of think about the look that I want to achieve. And when I select my fabric, you can always go to your materials section of your pattern and choose based on that. But you may not always want to quilt the same size as this. I'm actually going to go a little bit smaller, but I'm still going to follow the same dimensions, just not use as many finished blocks as this pattern has. And because this quilt finishes in 10" by 10" blocks, it's going to be really easy to adjust the size because we just aren't going to make as many blocks. So I selected my fabric. My background fabric is going to be this beautiful gray yardage. And then my colored fabrics are going to be this fat quarter bundle I got from Robert Kaufman. It's really beautiful. It's like speckled blues and there's a nice array of shades. So I think it's gonna follow this pattern very beautifully. So step two is complete. We have selected our fabrics. Okay, so now we're ready for step number three, which means we are going to prep our fabric. And so to do this, we're going to iron all of the fabric that we are going to be using in our quilt. So I'll take all of the fat quarters I have here and press them all. So I just go ahead and do this step all at once. I feel that's the most efficient rather than ironing one piece, cutting that piece, organizing out that piece. I think it's easier to finish each step before moving on. So I'll iron out all of these fabrics and get them all ready for cutting. So that is step three. And one thing to keep in mind is that if it's easier for you to work with fabric that has been starched, you could starch and iron at this point, because the starch will often allow you to finger press as you sew, or make it less likely for your fabric to stretch as you sew. So that is an option at this step as well. I'm just gonna press all these fabrics and get them ready for cutting. Okay, so I have my yardage all ironed and I have all of my fat quarters ironed. So I'm gonna start with the yardage first. So I'm just gonna set all the fat quarters to the side, out of the way. And the first thing I'm going to do to prep the yardage for cutting is to even out this edge over here. So I'm just gonna pick some lines on the fabric or on the cutting mat and cut a straight edge to go by. So you'll want to make sure, especially if you're going to cut through a lot of layers of fabric, that you have a really nice sharp rotary cutter. And after I said that, look here, I have I didn't go through all the fabric. I may not have just pressed hard enough, but so now I have an edge that's squared up. So now I can start cutting the measurements I need for my pattern. And so what I'm gonna do is line up the line on my acrylic ruler along here and cut. Try to apply some more pressure this time. And then I have that cut line I can line up my measurement line with and cut my next line. Now I have 4 layers of fabric here, so that's going to get me quite a nice amount of squares with these cuts after I finish doing them. It didn't sound like I cut through all of them. So it's a nice quick way to get all of your squares if you have a nice sharp rotary cutter and can cut through this many layers at once. So right now I'm just getting strips, and then I'm gonna pull this fabric to the side. And now we can turn our mat. We don't want to turn our fabric if we don't have to. I'm going to turn the mat, and then I'm going to cut my squares. So let's turn it and do that. Okay, so we have the mat turned, and turning the mat just is a little bit nicer because if we move the fabric, all those layers are going to shift and they're not going to be nice and straight. So as you can see, I still have the salvage end here of the fabric strips. So the first thing I'm going to do is trim those off. And now I have a nice straight line here to complete my squares. So the same thing, I'm going to line up my ruler so you can see I have a line here matching the top, and this line here I'm going to match along the side. And then I'm going to cut my squares. Ooh, do you see that? What I almost did? I don't have the one over at this side. I'm glad I caught that. I was like, man, this isn't looking right for some reason. Okay, let's regroup. We got everything lined up. And then cut our squares. So now this time I can just take these away so I have a nice line that I can see easily. Set those to the side and then line back up and cut my next squares. So I'll just go through and do this process with all the fabric that I need to cut. I'll just look at my cut requirements on the pattern. I'll cut strips in my fabric, and then I just turn my mat and cut them into the squares or whatever shape my pattern is calling for. And I feel like this gets pretty nice, accurate cuts, and it makes really quick work of it. And I feel like I can go through a lot of fabric, get a lot of squares cut all at once doing it this way. And then for my next cut, I actually need another size square from my this background fabric here before I even get to the blue fabrics, my fat quarters. So I'll just go back, square up my yardage. Oops. I'll go back and square up my yardage and cut the next size that I need. I really got this one mangled good, so I'm not going to cut that one again until I square it up, but I'll do these last two. And since that one's layers got too away from me there, I'll have to cut that one a little bit different. So this one, I'll open those up and I'll cut my my 3-inch squares from each end because it got shifted around too much and I couldn't be confident that I'd be able to cut even squares from that. It happens if you don't put enough pressure when you're cutting, sometimes with the rotary cutter, or if it's just not sharp enough, that can happen. So you won't want to cut it if the fabric shifts around too much like that. You'll need to lay them out and cut them individually. So it's important to make sure you're getting enough pressure. So I'm going to go through and cut everything, and then I'll show you the next step. Okay, you guys, so I finished step 4, which was cut all my pieces, and then I moved on to step 5, which is where I like to organize all my cuts. And a tray like this works really well for this, especially ones that have higher sides to keep all your fabrics from moving around. What I did here was I put clips on all the fabrics that I'm kind of done with to organize into blocks. But our next step after organizing everything is to plan out the quilt and kind of get our pre-assembly done. So I'll explain that next for step 6. So for step 6, which is our pre-assembly or any prep that we need to get done, I'm going to be taking all of these larger blocks that match up with the background blocks here, the gray, and we're going to be making these into half square triangles. So what I like to do is prep all of my background blocks, because I already know I need all of these, and it's just a quick way for me to do this step. So what I do is I take all of my background blocks and I'm gonna mark them corner to corner, because that's how we're gonna make our, that's how we're going to be making our half square triangles. So I just go through that whole pile, and I know it's tedious, but I draw a line corner to corner, because what we're going to be doing later is sewing these. So just to show you, I kind of go through and mark like that, and what I'm going to be doing after I get all these ready is sew a 1/4 inch seam along each side of that marked line, and that'll be paired up with one of these larger blocks. So if you want to here, you could organize all that to take to the sewing machine. Once you got one marked, you could place it on top, set it to the side, and just kind of have it all organized so that you can just sew them all together. And what I'll do is just quickly chain piece all of these after I have them prepped. So I'll get these all laid out, so I'll have that one ready, and I'll probably just do one color at a time so it's not too overwhelming, because if you have too many laying there, you could get things confused, and keeping it manageable is always important. So I would just lay these together, set them down. When I get them all ready, I would just organize them over by my sewing machine. Okay, so that is step 6, which is prep. So I'm just gonna get all these half square triangles prepped. Okay, so we're not moving on to the next step just yet. We're still in prep mode, but I want to share a few little tips and tricks I have come up with to help piecing a quilt become a little bit faster. And one of the things that I like to do is have everything organized. So when I sit down to sew, I can just sew. I don't have to get up and go find things I need to sew next. Like, everything is laid out next to me. So these are all the half square triangles I need to sew. They're all prepped, And I know marking the center of these was not fun. It was a lot to do all at once, but trust me, it makes quick work of everything. Just get that out of the way, organize everything next to you, and just get ready to sew. So that's one of my tips. And the second one is going to be showing you how I chain piece all of these to make quick work of it. So to chain piece these, what I'll do is start with one of these piles, and I'm going to start with the darkest first, and I'm going to sew one side of all of these. So by one side, I mean when I put this under my needle, I'm going to be sewing on the right side of that line that I marked. So I'm going to line up right at the red line that's on my foot. You might not have that, but I'm going a 1/4 inch away from that line on one side. So I'm going to start sewing. I'm going to try and be as accurate as I can, but for this particular pattern, it's nice because I'm going to be trimming these down to 2.5 inch squares. So if you're a little bit off, your trimming later will fix that. So for chain piecing, I'm just going to line up my next square. So I have, you know, right sides together on these triangles. I have it marked, and I'm going to sew a 1/4 inch from that line. So I think I have about 28 of these in each color. So I'm just going to go through and sew all these, and then I'll show you what I do next after I finish all of them in this pile. Okay, so we've sewed all of the dark half square triangles. So I'm going to raise my presser foot, and we're going to cut the strings. Now, I'm not going to cut any of these chain pieces apart, and you'll see why. I'm going to pull them all over here. It is a lot. Look at that long row of chained pieced half square triangles. Oh, I forgot to raise my needle. Okay, so what we're gonna do is we're gonna sew the other side, and I feel like this side goes a little bit faster because we already have all of our squares already lined up. So I'm just gonna start sewing across here to get this other side done. And I'm gonna slow down when I get to the next one just to make sure I'm lined up good. So I'm just gonna sew across these, and it makes really quick work of it, keeping them together. And because I'm doing all of these together, all of the same colors, I can keep them all organized nicely. So after I finish these, what I'll do is I cut them apart and I stack them, but I don't cut them in half yet, and I don't trim them or press them open yet. I just finish sewing all of these first and then do the next step all at once. And if I go step by step, getting all of these together all at once, I feel like it makes a lot quicker work of this because you're already in a groove with sewing. So just keep sewing. And then when you get to cutting, you can move everything over to that cutting and trimming stage and do that stage all at once, because you'll be in a groove with that, and you won't have to be going back and forth from each area of your sewing room or your dining room or wherever you sew at. You'll just have everything all together where you need it to be. And it's kind of like cooking, or when you cook and you're trying to put together a recipe, the easiest thing to do is gather all of your ingredients, all of your supplies first. That's the same with sewing. Make sure you have everything gathered, and then get everything prepped all at once so you're not rushing around. You're like, oh, I'm supposed to add this into the soup, but I don't have the carrots cut up. Make sure you have everything all ready to go so you can just get in a groove and get everything finished as efficiently as possible. All right, so we're just going to keep sewing here, and then we're going to move on to the next pile and follow that same method. All right, so we're still going to be working on our pre-assembly for a little bit. We have all of the half square triangles sewn. So what we're going to do now is we need to cut down the line we drew to separate each of these into 2 half square triangles, and then we need to trim. So I have this trim tool here. I'll put a link in the description of this video because it's actually super helpful. This one came with 2, so this has 1/2 inch half square triangles, like 1 1/2, 2 1/2. And then there's another one that came in the set that is for, you know, just whole numbers like 1 inch, 2 inch, 3 inch, 4 inch. So I really like using this. I think it's a lot easier than trying to line up on an angle on my regular rulers and trim it. And I'll show you why I like this one better. And I think it helps me go just a little bit faster. So let me move these. I'll start with my darkest set first and show you how to use these. So what you do is you're going to take one of them, and first we cut our square in half. So there we go. And then whatever size you need for half square triangles, so these are going to be 2 1/2 inch, you line up the dotted line here that shows the seam, and then you'll see your seam allowance area. So you line up that dotted line on your threads, and then you just trim the sides. And this is a little bit easier if I break out my rotating cutting mat. And then do you see these slots here? If you trim those, it'll take off those little dog ears for when you fold it open. So a perfect half square triangle. And then of course I'll need to press all these, and I'll show you those after. But let me show you why those little slots are so nice on this one. So let me line it up. So make sure it's nice and tight. You see how wobbly it was? Oh, it makes it so much easier. So trim. So if I didn't trim those little slots, it'll still work. It just, you have those little like ears that hang out there, kind of like dog ears, and it just doesn't, it won't make piecing these together as easy as if you have that little slot to trim them off. So I really love this slotted trimmer. Again, I'll put it in a link to it in the description here, because this has really changed my half square triangle game. It really makes piecing them together a lot cleaner. It looks a lot nicer. And after I press all these and you look at them, you'll just see how nice these turn out. So I'm gonna go through and do all of these, trim them up. Look at all that leftover stuff there that would have messed up my seams and made everything uneven if I didn't take the time to trim them off. And this is why this step is just so important. It does feel really tedious, and definitely doesn't seem like the most fun thing you could be doing. I'll just do this, listen to some podcasts, an audiobook, whatever, and just knock them all out. I mean, it's going to take some time, but if you sew these half square triangles and don't trim them and get frustrated and wonder why everything's not lining up nicely, why things get a little wonky, why your points don't meet nicely, this is probably why. Because if you skip this step, they're just not going to turn out as perfect as they could. So give it a try. Trim them up, get this tool, and make this step just a little bit easier. All right, so we'll meet back here in just a minute. So as you've probably come to notice, that this step 6, this planning and pre-assembly, kind of took some time, right? But you'll be really happy that you took the time to just get everything ready that you need. And as you can see, I got it all organized again. So what I did was, when I pressed all these half square triangles that I made that are this same color and then with our background, I pressed them all and kept them all organized together, because this is going to help me when I go to plan out all of my blocks. Everything is pressed, everything is ready to go. So when I start playing around with these and trying to figure out and assemble my blocks, I know exactly where everything is. And if I decide to go a different direction, like if I don't want all of my lights in one block, then I want to mix in some darks. If I did just the lights and pressed all those because I was excited and wanted to get started making blocks, I could start putting the block together and realize, man, this might look better if I added in some of the darker tones. Well, I don't have any of those ready, so I'm going to have to stop, get all of those ready, and then start planning again. So I think it just works a lot better if I get all of my pre-planning, pre-assembly, and everything done, and have everything ready to go just to start making my blocks. So let's move on to that step number 7, where we're going to start assembling our blocks. So we're moving on to step 7. So in this step, we're going to look at, for this quilt, it's a block diagram. So what that means is, in your quilt, maybe your layout is a little different, maybe it's not centered around blocks, but in this one, my quilt is going to be built up of about 30 different blocks. So when I start planning that step and laying everything out to sew my blocks together, it could take some time. I'm going to need different pieces, so I'll kind of get that all organized. And the first thing I know is that my background colors are not going to change, right? I'm not going to change those out, so I can lay out those pieces where they are going to go, and then kind of work around that with the other colors. So my first thing I'm going to do is lay out with just one block color, this light color, and see if I like it like that, because I may like just having each block its own specific color, this lightest color that I have. So I'll follow the diagram, lay everything out, and see if that's what I want to do. If I want everything in this block to be this background color and this light color. And I have a feeling from just what I've laid out so far that it's going to look really cute, but I'll probably still play around and see if it could possibly look better by making some simple little tweaks and adjustments, because you don't want to go with the first layout that you do. You may be able to make it a little bit better. So I'm going to put these back down here and keep everything organized, because if you look at this quilt pattern here, if you look closely at these blocks, they don't have the same pattern in it. It kind of gives this cool kaleidoscope look of everything changing. But if I leave it like this, maybe it'll look a little too plain. So I could try switching out some of these and kind of switch it up a little bit. I'll need 2 more over here. Well, that looks pretty cool, right? And then I could add in, you know, maybe make some of these a little darker. Maybe that's too much. Maybe that had changed it too much. So maybe, maybe if I did it like that, you know, and kind of have the dark coming through here. There's just a lot of different things you can do. So I'm gonna play around with this and just see what I end up thinking looks best. And once I get my blocks kind of figured out how I wanna go about this, how I wanna assemble them, then I'm gonna move on to sewing these blocks together. So once I get a layout that I like, I'm gonna need to move it over by my sewing machine. So what I like to do is use like something like these alphabetties, which I have here, or you can use little scraps of paper, whatever you have on hand to kind of mark your rows to keep everything organized. So I'll have row, well, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There's just what I have on hand is 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, but I'll know they go in order. And I stack my rows on top of each other. And at this point you could, you know, sew 1 block at a time after you get it organized, or if you have a bigger planning area, like a planning board or something like that, where you can get them all planned out and make sure you like how it looks. However you work best at this point. But I'm just going to show you with 1 block. This is how I line up my rows. And then I'll take the rows over to the sewing machine, and you could even stack them on top of each other. I'll take this over to the sewing machine, and then I'll lay the row back out and lay it, you know, kind of in reverse, lay them back out and be able to sew them together. But this just helps me keep organized. I can even take, you know, my Wonder Clips like I did here with the A and clip it to my row just to keep everything nice and organized, and so I don't get everything mixed up on which row went where or anything like that. So this is how I get everything organized to take to my sewing machine to sit down and sew the block together. So as we work through our quilt blocks, I just wanted to share with you how I quickly sew these together. And to do that, I use chain piecing. And I work 1 block at a time because I don't want to mix up my blocks or anything like that. So I have them all marked, the 11 through 15 that I showed you before, which would be row 1 through 5. So what I do is I make sure to mark each row. However you want to do that, whether, you know, with scrap pieces of paper, labeling them however you want. That's first. And then when I go through and sew my first pieces, I bring the first 2 squares in row 1 together, and I sew my 1/4 inch seam. Now you want to line up everything nicely and sew your seam just as you would any other block. But instead of taking your presser foot up and cutting your thread on after sewing along this first set, we're just going to keep on going. And one thing you'll notice with this method is not only do you save time, but you also save thread because you're not pulling off a bunch of thread and restarting. You're just bringing your squares together, the next two, and sewing along. And I'm struggling with lining these up because of the marker that I have on these two. After you get past all that, since this is such a small little square, it gets a little bit easier. But you see, I'm not taking time raising my presser foot, and I'm not wasting thread moving, pulling the thread out and snipping those. I'm just sewing one after another. And because you have these markers on each row, if you get confused, you'll know exactly where they go. But I love using, I'm just moving these numbers over. I love using little tricks like this because if you do like being able to get through a lot of quilts quickly, or if this is a step that you typically find to be tedious, which this is my favorite part. Sewing everything together is my favorite part. I like seeing it all come together. I find the most tedious thing to me with quilting is trimming all of my half square triangle blocks. That probably took me the most with this one just because I do not enjoy it, and I don't enjoy pressing them open. And so here, so we did the first two of all the rows. So then I'm gonna raise my presser foot, and I just like to bring it right over. So let me trim that off. And so what doing this does is I can keep it just lined up. If I just bring it over like that, I'll trim those to separate it. And I don't press yet because this unpressed seam isn't gonna affect anything. I press all of them when I have sewed all the rows together, and then I'll know what direction to press all my seams to nest them later. So I could press row 1, all of them to the right, or all my odd rows to the right and all my even rows to the left, however I want to do that. But I don't need to press them right now. This is just gonna save me time because I can just stay sitting here and sew all of my next squares on. So I'll just fold that one over, come back over here, and then I can sew 5 more of these little squares on to all these rows before I need to even raise my presser foot again. So, bring this over and sew. And the only thing you'll need to really, as long as you stay really organized and keep all of your blocks or all your little squares, making sure that they're facing in the right direction, this can really help you move along quickly. You just need to stay really organized. You can't, you know, you don't want to accidentally turn one of these the wrong way, and you don't want to accidentally sew this to the wrong side. That's why I keep the start of my rows all marked. But as long as you stay organized, this can be quick moving, putting all your blocks together. And usually during this time, I'll have, you know, my headphones in and I'll listen to a podcast, or I'll listen to an audio book. And it's just really relaxing just being able to sit here. Just sit here and sew because I have all of my stuff all ready to go. I already have blocks over at my cutting table that are all set and ready to organize, and all I need to do is move them over here after I finish this one and sew them next. So then now I just have 2 more squares to sew onto these rows. And you know, you could also check and make sure at each stage that everything's facing in the right direction, that you haven't accidentally flipped everything, because if you catch it now, you can take out that seam and fix it. It's a lot easier to do it at one of these stages than when you've sewn all these rows together and then you look and see, oh man, I have all these together and I sewed, you know, this block, the square facing the wrong direction, because I've definitely done that on quilts before. But I just think this is a really quick way to get through this stage of the quilt. So hopefully that gave you a few tips. All right, well, I'm gonna finish this up, press it, and complete this block, complete all my 29 others after I finish this one, and then we'll be moving on to organizing these blocks into the quilt top. All right, you guys, thanks. Okay, so we're on the last step of how I put together a quilt top. And as you can see, I kind of changed my mind a little bit on how I was going to put this quilt together. So what I did was I have 4 by 5 blocks here. Then these are going to be for a baby quilt. I'm really loving the way it looks with all these different blues. And then here I'm gonna have like a play mat and, you know, a good place to do tummy time, and that's just the 3 by 3. And then I have 2 levies here. So I already ordered the fabric for the back of the play mat and the levies. It's a minky material. And then I just got a dark cotton blue for the back of the baby quilt. So this is gonna be a set that I'm gonna put together, and I think it's gonna be really cute. So to finish this off, what I'm gonna do is sew together the rows on the quilt, kind of like I showed with the squares here, the block squares. So I'm just gonna sew together the rows and then press that in different directions so that I can nest the seams and then just sew all the rows together. So pretty simple to finish the quilt top up. And of course, I'll show you how they look when they're all finished.